Let's take a look at Victory Games Central America. In a sense, this is maybe the peak of a family of games. So, you got the Fleet series by Balkowski. We just did a Balkowski game, which handles naval combat in the 80s, essentially. With the basic concept being NATO and primarily the U.S. Navy facing the Soviet Navy with additional forces present. And there's a bunch of fleet games. They're very popular. I never got all that into them. I've started collecting them. I think I have all but one at this point. I had one or two of them early on, and I was just kind of I wanted Task Force. Now I own it, and I thought I would be really into the genre and everything. And honestly, it just didn't do it for me. I don't know why. It's a very interactive game, and I could only play it solitaire. Then you have Gulf Strike and its little twin Aegean Strike, which so. The Fleet series primarily is worried about naval combat in an era where the aircraft carrier is just so far and away the king. Submarines, etc., are of some importance. Gulf Strike takes that naval, very similar naval rules, throws in air rules that are kind of similar. If I recall correctly, I may be a little mistaken there. And also throws in some ground rules that are clunky and kind of painful to use. Supplies are really important in them, and again, beautiful looking system. The rules look so intense and everything, and I started playing it, and I'm kind of like, and I just never got all that into it. Well, like I said, this is sort of what I see as the final stage of this. Not only does it have somewhat similar, not quite as detailed air rules, it doesn't have the naval rules. So in a way, Gulf Strike may be closer to that, to what I'm talking about. But this was an extension of similar types of ideas. It takes significant air rules. You do have carriers, but they're just represented really as off-board boxes with all the planes on. But what this really worries more about is the insurrection nature of the warfare, and it's centrally in Central America, and it's focusing on the Nicaragua situation. But you know, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, they all kind of come into play in it. But it's about the Sandinista revolution and its aftermaths. I think I like it a little more than Gulf Strike. And in part, that's why I was able to get to it. Let's talk about, and I had this right from the beginning. I think it may be just too much game for me right now. We'll see why. This is the basic game rules, called the conventional game. They don't. They didn't want to call this the basic game because there's nothing basic about this, right? But it's the equivalent, and so I make it as kind of a joke. 64 pages, dense rules. On the bright side, there's a lot of repetition in them. So you're not really reading through 64 pages of the same stuff. It's basically, instead of a lot of cross-referencing, there's a lot of additional, there's a lot of information that gets repeated in it. And there are advantages to that. You can make the rule book very readable in the sense that, well, one of the things they do is they make it readable. There's a lot of description and discussion, and then a series of notes that kind of handle some of the more special cases. But and you can avoid having to flip through the rule book very much. In some cases, this works very well. In this particular game, it's just so much. I find myself having skimmed through the rules again. Certainly the first time I played it, I probably struggled a little bit more. I don't know how much I understand them, and we're going to kind of skim through them as I go through them more than I usually do. Back away from the rules a little bit. Try to give more of the flavor of the game rather than all the details, because there's a lot of procedural stuff in here, and I don't know. It goes along with the dry nature of the game. You've got your map, which is very, very colorful, 80s style map. It doesn't bother me. I know some people would be like, but you know, it's got the different terrain types very clearly visible to you. I actually find the different greens, and I find the color scheme kind of appealing in a sort of way. It took me a long time to start to see why people didn't like maps like this. I kind of understand it now, but I feel like it expresses the information very effectively. You've got this monstrosity looking thing of a combat chart, which is working on the different terrain types with the odds ratios on them, and then it's got these colors that indicate who has to retreat, and there's rules for distinguishing between whether you use the odds column or the specifics of the die rolls. Well, actually, you can always use the specifics of the die rolls, can't you? No, not here. Not here. No. Yeah. So we'll get into those in a little bit. Terrain key, a lot of information here, different types of population centers, etc. For an insurrection game, it doesn't really deal much with the hearts and minds type aspects of it. It is primarily a military get victory points type of thing. Each player has one of these charts. Now, so there's this conventional game rulebook, the basic game as I call it, and we're going to start with one of them. I don't know how many games we're going to pull through, how many scenarios we're going to pull through in this. I hope to get at least a couple in. I'm starting off with a very simple conventional game, and it'll be a real waste to work through that 64-page rulebook without dealing with the further additional rules of the intervention game, which concentrates on scenarios where U.S. and communist non-Central American powers are intervening directly in the action. Well, directly including things like CIA and other forces that are kind of military advisor types. This is what? It doesn't tell you. Another 40 pages of rules. This is not a scenario book. This is a significant, most of the scenarios actually require both of these rule books. I haven't even read this one yet because I want to get a feel for playing around with that conventional game. Now, I've read it before, and I've played the different scenarios. You also have, of course, your scenario book, and there's a lot of scenarios in here. That's 68 pages. Boy, paper was cheap back then, wasn't it? It's not that glossy shit either. Lots and lots of scenarios, but one of the most important things to me was the scenario generation system, which kind of allows you to take a look at the situation about the time the game came out and say, what happens if the U.S. takes a certain stance and the Soviets take a certain stance, and you roll some randomness and you get what kind of the intervention levels for those powers are, and how much force they're able to devote to the Nicaraguan, I don't know what to call it, civil war, I guess. It is possible I'm missing some pieces. I think it's highly unlikely, but I unfortunately stored a lot of the pieces in a tray, and it's been Jesus Christ. probably close to 20 years since I've played this, so. Yet it has been kind of floating around near the top of my thoughts always, because unlike Gulf Strike and the Fleet games, I have had some fun with this comparatively. I haven't been as entirely displeased. You have a lot of counters. Yeah. These are mainly informational down here, but you've got things like the CIA. We got Mossad somewhere. There's a Mossad counter. Just about any Palestinians have a counter in here. Libya, I think, does. Yeah, there we go. You have all these things from sort of the Communist International. You have the U.S. forces. Not a lot of other allied forces there. And then you have forces from Central America itself. So in this scenario we have set up here, it's Honduras and El Salvador. We're going to do the soccer war. This is Somoza. We have the insurrectionist forces. So things like the FLMN, the PFLP, ARDE, etc. This isn't all we have. Over here, we've got pretty much the U.S. intervention and Soviet intervention forces over there. Oh, what about these charts? So something, if you're used to the Gulf Strike type of thing, you have these air displays which hold groups. You have to have these on the board in order to operate your air units, and you can distinguish whether the plane is available to be used, or if it's already been used, or something else which is sitting, which means you've got that airfield overpopulated with planes, and that's not really a good thing. You basically got planes you can't fly. Unlike Gulf Strike, if I recall Gulf Strike correctly, you only get to use your planes once per turn in this. Well, yeah, I think so. I think they recycle once per turn. Here's your sequence of play. Essentially, there's a complicated enough track of that. Game turn track, pretty explanatory. Each player has a number of counters that they have to keep track of. Things like replacement points, insurrection points, maybe special munitions, all kind of crap like that is tracked on there. What else do we have here? Okay, we talked about the ground combat. We also have the air combat system here. And I mean, there's tons of information and modifiers, etc. This is usually put in little play aid booklets. It's not here. Victory points. World tension. You can do things that can cause problems. And they also indicate the intervention levels that are in play as to how much the U.S. is willing to devote here, because sending the 82nd Airborne into Nicaragua is something that just didn't happen. But if tensions had gotten high enough, it's possible that it could. What are these? B-52s can fly through there. These are where the carriers are held. Each player has. What's this? This is little sheets to keep track of what victory point hexes you're currently owning for the two players. Photocopies, I think. I hope. Okay, what's in the charts and tables? Well, this is creating insurgents, various loads for air transport. The Gulf of Fonseca over here. It becomes very important in the intervention. Well, even in conventional scenarios, a lot of operations through there. It's the joining of what you got Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador all kind of touching, and Tiger Island, which is an important location that the CIA has their base on. So. So you've got values for various components on the map. So things like air facilities, ports, etc. They all have points of stuff that can be brought in through them. You got rules for planes bombing stuff. That can be both terrain and it can be ground units. The air combat is reproduced over here along with paratrooper rules, helicopter assault, air defense. Terrain effects is mainly summarized there, but there's more detail here. All the different supply source rules. Yeah, there's a lot here. This is intervention. This is intervention game stuff. How things happen that are going to drive that. You make rolls on the world tension and see how that moves. Weather effects. You're allowed to repair bases and such not. Chemical weapons. This is for the scenario generator. Both players get a doctrine, and you combine, you cross-reference those to see what level of play there is. And this is really all that set up the choose your own adventure game. What about units? So units are largely distinguished. Well, first of all, planes look like airplanes, and they're over here. See if I can remember. I don't think I can. This is the bombing value. And the letter next to that is the counterinsurgency value. You want a higher bombing value. The counterinsurgency, you want to be as close to A as possible. That indicates a multiplier on how much you're capable of preventing an insurgency. So the movement rate. Over here is the air combat value with a speed modifier next to it. So this is a 1 slow. It's basically a propeller plane. It's able to intercept and fight things that are slower than it. And I don't know what else to say about that. Okay, what about ground units? And you have some different kinds of things like anti-air and fixed anti-air facilities, etc. So here's your ground unit. The lower numbers, that I had a shadow. To the left is the attack, and to the right is the defense combat value. Above that is the movement point allowance. Kind of hard to read. They don't really jump out at you. The dark on dark, etc. Really pretty colors for the counters, just like Gulf Strike. Really hard to read, and it's getting harder with age. Units are generally 2-step units. Armored units may have 3 or 4 steps. They have a replacement counter. What else? Very important location for some of the scenarios is Messiah, which is I think that's it. Which is where the electronic warfare capabilities of the Nicaraguans are centered. The U.S. will be using EWACS, AWACS, and various different EW fighters. There may be some EW planes from other nations as well. I haven't really pawed through everything. One thing of note, I'll probably mention this again later, but this is the game. Looking at the game now made me look up and find the Sheridan tanks, because I saw paradropable tanks, and I have always it's hard to find any information on them without knowing what you're looking for to begin with. And I've Googled it and kind of said, well, wait, did they drop tanks? And asked people I knew in the military, and because I would see things like this showing up in some games that were kind of modern, and I would see Beetle Bailey cartoons that had tanks coming down with parachutes. Well, it doesn't quite look like that. Basically, it's a very light tank that is actually able to be deployed from a plane without landing and debarking it. You have to fly pretty damn low and slow to drop the things. And they were pretty crappy. But yeah, the 82nd Airborne has them in it. They've been decommissioned in a while. It was funny because trying to inform myself, sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't know. Without being able to find information about it. But Google, I tried doing that about paradropping tanks, and I saw some stuff where it looks like they're just about to do it. But no, they did it before. These things were being used from like the late 60s until, well, they existed. I don't know if they were used. From the late 60s until the early 90s, and then they were just discontinued as a really dumb idea. But now apparently there's more movement towards trying to get an effective paradroppable tank, which, again, something I didn't think existed. So, what about our counters? Is just a bunch of shit here. This is terrain type stuff, the persistent chemicals, effects from air support. Oh, we haven't talked about helicopters because I don't have any in this scenario. So let's take a CIA helicopter. Okay, it's an air unit, sort of. And you can see it's got a 1D. D means it's slower than slow. It can't intercept. You basically have jets, slow, and then defense only. So this can't be used as a gunship or anything, but it does have some bombardment value and transport value. That's what the little square there is on any planes that have transport. Whew. I don't remember what that is. Well, shit me. And this is its range. I said movement allowance or speed or something like that. It's the range. And it's really the operating range, which means you can fly that far, conduct a mission, and fly that far to get back someplace. We will look and see what that middle number is, because I don't know what it is. Ground value, yeah, okay, so that can be used. So this is the interesting thing, that the helicopters have a bombardment value, but they also have sort of a strafing value, how capable they are of adding a ground combat strength points to a ground combat just by operating them. Okay. So, how do you dig into 64 fucking pages of rules? Well, we're going to start a little bit. I'm going to probably do this over several days because there's just so much. Sequence of play is spelled out here. Let's go over very, very broadly. You have a ground and air stage where basically you're conducting your movement with ground units and air units. This is it's an I go, you go game, right? And supply phase, ground unit reorg, supply you check units to be in supply. You've got depots, which are expendable, that you'll have to deploy possibly by air to get to certain areas if you can't trace a normal supply line. Supply lines are going to be traced through the roads. The ground unit reorganization, you're able to take damaged units, and at the beginning of the game, El Salvador, for this scenario, has a bunch of already, they have units that need to be reinforced. And you can kind of expend reorganization points if you're in supply and you're not next to an opponent, and your unit will go up to full strength eventually. Then you do normal movement. Then you have this special insurgency movement phase. The insurgency units can move normally, but they can also move inside the insurgency phase. Instead move inside the insurgency phase, where they have slightly different capabilities. Among their capabilities are they can kind of infiltrate better. They have a reserve capability. Armor is going to have that too. But then you have insurgency placement, where you try to put insurgency units. I didn't mention, insurgency units have this white band on them. In this scenario, the only two insurgency units are special forces. Most insurgency units are what you'd expect, actual insurgencies, and they are like that without the special forces symbol. When you want to put an insurgency unit that you have available on the board, you count from a unit that's capable of placing it some number of hexes, you expend an insurgency point, and you basically try to form a resource there. Well, when you declare that you're doing that, the enemy has the capability to send air missions in on an aerial counterinsurgency, and those can be helicopters. Helicopters and air units are going to move significantly differently. If the counterinsurgency is able to get enough bombardment points with the counterinsurgency modifier and all that in play, they prevent the insurgency unit from being formed, and the points used to create it are lost. Which means your insurgencies simply aren't going to happen if they're near enemy air units unless you can give air cover to the insurgency operations. You have to be able to send, to be able to intercept whatever counterinsurgency is happening. And that's kind of an important concept to keep in mind. Although, I guess if the opponent doesn't have many air units, you might be able to overwhelm him by building lots of insurgency units, because his air units can only be used so many times, and those are resources, so many times per turn, well, once, and those are resources that, I had a word for this, I don't know. Anyway, it's a limited number of resources, how many planes you can have, but there's a limited amount of insurgency points too, so I wouldn't worry too much. You have to roll a die to make insurgencies occur as well, and if they occur, then the opponent has the chance to neutralize them. Then you're allowed to try to roll to disband your insurgency units and get the points back for them. Well, that might be important if you're trying, if you've got a sector of the board, whatever, that you've got insurgency units in that are not doing you much good. It might be better to reclaim the points and use them where they're important. Okay, then the player whose turn it is allowed to conduct air missions. And there's a whole series of air mission types here: bombardment, close air support, ground combat, transfer, which is moving the planes themselves, transport strike, which is moving cargo. And each of these can have an escort with it. Helicopters, you just move them on the map without using an air mission. However, without using a special marker, when you launch planes from a base, you use one of these little airplane markers. There's only one for each side, which indicates the currently operating mission, and you move that along. Why do you need these differentiation? I am not really sure. I don't have a good argument for it. Generally, you're not going to be sending a whole big stack of helicopters to do something, but you probably aren't using too many planes. Now, there's coordination rules for planes from different bases. In general, you'll be sending a mission up from a single base, but if you have appropriate EW capabilities, you're able to kind of link things together. And I think it's like 3 hexes, although maybe AWACS and Messiah are able to do more than that, but I don't think so. We'll get to that somewhere or another. Maybe we don't go through the whole rule book. We just go through the sequence of play and then flip through the rest and see what's interesting and important. Because again, I don't want to focus too much. It's a heavily procedural rule book. And I think it's easier if you're trying to learn the game through things for me to spotlight specific instances and show you them as they're happening rather than reading rules to you. Which is different from how I always do it, but there's a lot here. Okay. So after the planes are done with their mission In general, they return back to base. Helicopters sometimes do something different. They hover over the area. So like if you're providing a transport mission, you can keep the helicopters in the game in the hex that they went to, and in fact they might be able to support ground combat. I think the only ones that can do that are the CIA. But okay, then you go to a ground combat phase. In general, ground combat is adjacency. It's optional, but if you do make an attack, you have to attack all adjacent units with at least something. Now, you can split this up to soak off attacks. Okay. Then, if you have armored reserve markers, which you place during your movement phase with tank units, you decide to move only half your movement allowance, not attack, and you prepare them for a breakthrough, they're able to push forward and conduct breakthrough movement. Then you go to another insurgency disbandment phase. Hey, didn't like how combat went. I think I can, or I really liked how it went. I think I can disband some of my insurgents. An additional helicopter transport phase, which is, you already had the transport strike in the air mission phase. You have another opportunity to move stuff more rapidly with helicopters at this point. Return to base. Helicopters that are on the board at this point have to rebase at the end of the turn. That may be the hex that they're in, because helicopter basing, so airplane basing, it has to be on airfields. Helicopter basing can be kind of more ad hoc. And then if you have any reinforcements coming in from the scenario, they come on the board at that point. Then we do the same thing for the other player, and you hit the end of turn stage. Phase track allows you to keep track of all these different phases more easily. The info record tracks a whole bunch of counters that are on them. We've talked about all this. My battery is running out. My throat is running out. But let me flip through and give some brief information on other rules. And we may just kind of gloss over these a great deal. I'm not going to remember everything. I'm going to have to refer to these rules quite a bit during play. So that's, one of the issues. There's a lot here. It's kind of interesting because when I first started doing the game videos, nobody was doing these for war games for the most part. Marco, I think, may have started a little earlier than I did. I don't remember. I really don't. He certainly started doing reviews before I started doing reviews. I was just doing the playthroughs. But nobody was doing playthroughs of them. And now I have to be more careful, or I should be more careful, I'm not, with like, hey, is anybody doing what I'm thinking? Did anybody do what I'm thinking of? Am I wasting my time in covering something someone else had already covered? Because quite frankly, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get through my collection anymore. And yeah, it's not that I expect to die in the next year, but I mean, it's possible, but it's much more likely just that my pace has slowed down, and I just look at the count and I'm like, I'm getting pretty old in terms of like what I can absorb and deal with. Like, this is probably beyond me. I don't think I could pick this up now. And it's kind of, I've got some that I'm kind of aspirational about. I'm sure most of you who are my age or older are in the same realm where you're like, oh yeah, I always wanted to, I don't know if I want to try this anymore. But even facing this after, having played it several times, ouch, it hurts. Okay, let's talk about air units. We've talked about the values on them, and you can see how the rules kind of handle it. This little dot to show you which thing they're highlighting. It's clever design there. Anything too exciting here? We've got the stacking limitations by different types of airports, the airstrip, the airport being bigger. You have limitations. Some planes can't use certain types of airport. Okay. You're able to activate 2 air units at a time from a given air strip to launch in a mission, but that can be combined with other air bases. But Puente Huete, which is over here, I don't know. I think it's this one. Near Messiah, which is the important part, can throw 6 up in the air, and carriers can throw more if that's an issue. If both players so if somebody puts your air base into a zone of control, it reduces how much can be. Oh, I'm sorry. It's 6 from a normal base, and then let me see what we got here. No, this is the basing limits is here. So 4, 12, and 20. But there's also limits to how many can be activated, which is 4, 10, and 20. And again, this is all spelled out in one of those charts. So let's stop talking about it. But if you throw it in a zone of control, you put restrictions on it. If you capture an airbase, a certain number of the planes can flee with an immediate transfer mission. The AWACS, because it's almost always up in the air and is being serviced in the air, etc., doesn't really get displaced by the capturing, or it doesn't have a problem with the capturing, but it gets displaced, and it actually goes to the used marker if it displaces, which means it won't be helping anymore. But it is always able to displace. In the intervention game, the U.S., and maybe I don't think there are any in the conventional, the U.S. is able to capture air bases and use them, capture Nicaraguan air bases and use them themselves. Different time periods different points where you can activate, and again, there's special rules for how you activate the different types of airplanes, the joint missions. You have to have the EW to coordinate them, and yeah, AWACS and Messiah have a 10 hex range. The 10 hex range from Messiah is actually spelled out on the board to make life a lot easier on you. 3 hex range is easy to do. The AWACS, well, you're on your own with that, man. They didn't give you any templates. There's international combination rules for joint air missions, where you want to combine units from different bases into a mission. What is the general rule with movement? The number on the movement allowance is the number of hexes of range that the plane can make to get to its mission. Now, certain missions, like the transfer mission, you double your range because you're moving the plane itself. It's not heading out half of it's not heading out half the distance and coming back. You can make arguments that, what about ideas like basing planes, in the Soviet Union temporarily so that they can refuel or whatever during World War II? Well, the game doesn't go into that depth. I think Gulf Strike may, which just results in a different kind of numbering system and a bit of pain, but they didn't do it here. EW units are going to give you modifiers in the air combat rules. So with helicopters, a lot of the times you move them partway through their mission. They turn 90 degrees on the board to indicate that they've done sort of half a mission, and then they can do the return to base, and they turn to the 180 degrees, which indicates that they can't do anything else after that, because they they stay in their hex before they decide whether to return. Helicopters, you can flip them over. They have a half-strength side, just like units do. I don't think you can repair them, but I don't recall that being the case. Okay, when you do an air mission, You have to actually trace on the board with your air mission marker. Okay, we should go back to the helicopters, because helicopters can be intercepted. Let me see if it's in here. No. There we go. Okay. Helicopters aren't detected the same way planes are. They're detected when they enter a hex containing an enemy ground unit. And that ground unit is within range of an electronic warfare asset. Or if they enter an air group marker for whatever reason, the planes can scramble and do something about the helicopter. Okay. There's special rules for the CIA headquarters helicopter. As I said, it's able to transport and do bombing or close air support. That's pretty much it. And they go into the specifics of how to handle that, which is actually a complicated mechanism for like 2 counters in the game. Okay, with air missions, it's a little different than with helicopter missions. You launch the air mission from a base. It's a counter on the board. It traces its path. When you move through a hex containing enemy units capable of performing air defense attacks, like ground-based SAMs or something, they can do so, and there's tables for that. Your intercept capability for air units has nothing to do with ground units. It is just being within range of the EW asset. You're up higher. If you're detected, fighters can scramble to deal with you. Helicopters, staying so close to the ground, whatever, are able to evade the EW alone. You've got to combine the EW with ground unit spotting. Different missions. Counterinsurgency. This is an attempt to remove the counterinsurgency or the insurgency unit by just dropping bombardment points. Basically, if you get there, you do it, and the insurgency unit is destroyed. Bombardment strike. Okay. There's different things you can attack. You can bombard ground terrain features, ports, airports, roads, stuff like that. There's no interdiction per se in the game, but you can blow up roads, and that's a big deal if I recall correctly. I haven't looked too carefully at this, but you can look. The movement point costs, especially for armor, are particularly painful going through ugly terrain. And when you're talking about mountain jungle, armor actually can't move, and swamps. No, apparently not. I swear, I thought that this was more extensive than it is. Might be something else. But the mountain jungle, which is this brown crap, that's just nasty, nasty terrain. The armor units can't move through it except on the road, and I think they're not able to advance into hexes after combat in jungle, mountain jungle, and swamp. I think that's why there's a movement point cost there for armor. We can see what those say if I can read this. So jungle doesn't have one. Swamp has a B. Armor units move one. Oh, yeah. So armor has to go one at a time through the swamps and the mountain jungle as well, which means you can't move a stack of armor through it. That has limited impacts on the game, except, yeah, it has pretty limited impacts, I think. We'll see. I don't think it has a major factor in it. Oh, these are little boxes for the AWACS. Okay. Oh, what the hell was I talking about? Oh, yeah, interdiction type attacks, which there's nothing specific to it. There's blowing up bridges, blowing up roads. But there's also ports and airports and such not that you can blow. You can also try to just drop crap on enemy units. And I don't know if we're going to be able to see anything too valuable there. Ground unit bombardment, you're trying to cause step losses on it, and it ends up that that you need a fair number of bombardment points to have a good chance of doing stuff to it. The terrain feature bombardment, what you'll see is, let's see, 1 point Well, 1 point can't do anything to a unit, so you're looking at 3 points. So a unit at 3 points, you've got a 50-50 chance of hurting the terrain feature, but the unit, you only have a 1/3, so whatever. I am, of course, kind of stupid, so I tend not to bomb terrain features as much as I should probably, and waste my planes bombing ground units, which is not as effective. However, there are better things you can do. You can do close air support, where you're adding, you throw a single plane with possible escorts to support it, and possible things for the other thing, which is ground combat support. But that's only with helicopters. Okay, close air support, you use your bombardment factors to add a modifier to the combat table. And that's going to be, you need a bombardment value of 1 or more. And I think it's half your bombardment value is added as bonuses to it. I'm looking. No, each bombardment value you put in adds a +1 to the die roll for combat. Escort missions, the idea there is just planes that are flying with your other planes to provide defense against interceptors, but there's some weird shit that goes on with here, and this is why, like, I'm gonna find things in these rules, because I noticed this when I was reading through it, and I only skimmed, and there's no way I can memorize these fuckers. The escort planes are able to kind of change their mission if you're not intercepted. They can become bombardment or close air support, if I recall correctly, which is kind of an interesting, weird little thing. Let's see if I can find that. Yeah, you don't have to announce which units are performing an escort until the opposing player announces the interception. That's very odd. Now, that's very different from, I think, the fleet games. I think the fleet games, you have mission counters in them, and you definitely do in the Gulf Strike game. Okay. Here, if your mission's not intercepted, you can choose to just make them all bombers if you want. Ground support mission, helicopters have that extra number on them, bottom center number, just below the transport number if it's present. And that's a number of additional strength points that they can add to attacker or defending units, which is kind of a weird thing. They also, like many cases, add a combat shift, a column shift to the combat if they do that. How did I remember that? I don't know. That's the magic of these things. Somehow I skimmed it, and I know a fair amount. You can do the opposite, combat support in defense. Now, there's some complexities about, hey, what happens, if the hex is taken or whatever, because the helicopter's there, and that can cause additional casualties. There's something I haven't gone into about air missions yet, which is, if you're intercepted, these are the air combat missions, but basically, or these are the air combat results table, and that's where it'll come in. But basically, if you get a certain type of result, a retreat result, you can decide to ignore it and just take additional losses. And you basically double your losses. That's a high cost, but if the mission is important, that makes sense. Interception mission, this is a defensive mission. If somebody flies within your detection range, you're able to just launch planes. And you don't do any kind of chasing them around on the map or anything. They halt and pause as your planes come and hit them. And then you fight in air combat. Transport missions, these are a number of different types. One type is transfer, where, as I said, you have double the movement to get from one base to another. Then there's transport strikes, where you have to worry about how much carrying cargo capacity you have. I believe you're able to use multiple planes to carry a single item, a single unit. Helicopters can do this. And again, there's a lot of specific rules, so there may be something where, I hope there's something, I don't think I remember it though, where you can't carry one of them Sheridans on on a transport helicopter. I don't know. Paradrop rolls. Okay. You're able to paradrop into a hex containing friendly ground units in any terrain, or into an unoccupied hex in clear or rough terrain. Now, there's a die roll to see if this succeeds, beyond interception or anything like that. So there's a chance that your paradrop fails, or causes casualties. Step losses, basically. Helicopter assaults is your helicopter moves into a hex with enemy units, and, well, it doesn't have to have enemy units. It succeeds if you do it where there's no enemy units. But basically the helicopter stays there. This can and can support the fighting if it's capable of doing that, whatever. And it could actually rebase to there, conceivably. The load capabilities, they're in the square number on the helicopter. Unit size, there's a load size here for all the different types of units. And we'll get to stacking in a little bit. And I think that's enough for quite a while. We'll see if I remember everything that I babbled on about. I feel like I did a pretty good job so far. Hey, we got through about half the rules of the conventional game. And really, the complex, there's a lot of complex stuff in the intervention game as well. But there's a lot of complex stuff in here too, so don't feel too much like, oh God, I don't want to see that. I mean, you shouldn't, because you don't want to hear more of me, but okay. So where were we? Starting with ground units. There's not a whole hell of a lot here that's exciting and new, and I'm going to kind of assume that we can deal with this. There's a lot of effort being used to spell out these elements in a way that most war games actually don't. However, often you find the important stuff is in these little notes rather than other things. So like insurgency units have special capabilities if they choose to move as insurgency units. Zones of control, a little different from most designs. Let me find it. Not too. So first of all, you only exert a zone of control if you have a defense value of 2 or more, but it's per stack. And there are units that have only a 1 defense value. Let me see. Here's one, for example, on the board. Remember, it's the right-hand number. There are markers to indicate that there's no enemy zone of control for a reason. Generally, that's going to be size being affected, I think. I'm looking to see the impact of the zone of control. I remember there being, that's what I remember, there being something weird about it. So you have to end movement when you enter a zone of control. You can exit it, but it costs you an extra movement point to do so. That's the twisty thing. And you can move from one zone of control into another zone of control, but that uses your entire movement allowance. They also have impacts on retreat and supply lines, none of which are too shocking. Not specified here. Okay. Transportation. Okay, for air transport, basically you're doing the air transport mission. You have to fit into the load capacity, the little box on the planes. Boat transport, Allied, that's interesting, battalion or company size infantry and communist brigade size or smaller infantry can use boat transport. This allows you to move along the coast, I believe, but also there's rules for crossing Lake Managua there. You have to start in an undamaged. So for the normal, you have to start in an undamaged port, or within 5 contiguous hexes of such a port, which cannot be traced through land hex sides. You can trace them through mixed hex sides, though. The port can't be damaged or be in the zone of control. Each port can transport 1 unit per turn. Only infantry can use it. The CIA EW engineers or an AWACS unit can impact boat transport. Basically, you move the ground unit that's in a port or within 5 hexes of that port to any other coast or island hex not occupied by enemy ground units that's within 5 contiguous coast hexes of the port. Tiger Island, if there's a CIA EW engineers in there, that can detect communists using boat transport within 3 hexes of it. And you have to roll a die on this little table, which generally, all but on a 1, will cause the movement to fail and a step loss. So you generally won't do anything there. Boat transport is never restricted in Lake Nicaragua. Oh wait, Lake Nicaragua down here, not Managua. For the communist player, as long as they control the 2 ports that are actually on the lake. This one's on the ocean. That's not clearly visible. I mean, it is. It overlaps into there. Okay. And they've got some rules here like Brahma cannot be used for boat transport. What's up with that? 3319. Oh, yes. So this is a special river port, and it conducts movements down to El Bluff only. So it's something special. Let's go to river transport. Infantry at Bluefields or El Bluff. I'm sorry, these 2. Can move to Rama and vice versa before spending any movement point allowance. It's just an extra jump in movement by using the river. And very, very limited special rule that this is a level of detail that I don't really know how important it is. The guys who worked on this, one of them especially, let me see if I've got the designers listed right here. I don't have them very easily. You know, you've got like, I think the main designer is a military guy who was probably heavily involved in this. It's not a common wargame designer. And, you know, I mean, he's done a wonderful job. Here we go. Let's see. James McQuaid. He may have done a couple of other things, modern stuff. But a high level of detail in terms of, you know, the specifics of the situation and things like this. The Tiger Island I understand a little bit more, but this seems like minutia to me that I don't know. Anyway, I've spent more effort on it than I need to. Stacking. You got stacking point limitations, and they differ by who's trying to stack. And I don't understand the concept behind this. I understand the rule. Okay, for most nations, you have these stacking points here, the US being the exception, and a given hex can hold a maximum of 5 stacking points, but no more than 4 units. Okay. And if US is mixed with allied forces, they follow those rules. But if the US is alone, they can have 4 battalions. There's support units, which are special forces, engineers, artillery, self-propelled artillery, anti-tank, blah, 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 blah. Armor units must move. Okay, why is this in stacking? Well, it sort of is. 1 at a time through swamp and mountain jungle hexes. However, they can stack together in the hex as long as they're within the stacking limits. Given that this is an I go, you go game, I'm not quite sure what impact that has. Maybe I'm not grasping something, but there must be some specific reason for that. I don't remember there being any overruns in this, so I'm more disturbed. Reserve movement. You have a special reserve movement phase where you're able to move half your movement allowance with armored units as long as they didn't do anything. And we kind of touched on that before. Terrain features, we have all the detailed information of the different terrain features. We've kind of been covering some of them. They're just repeated here. They're also included in the rules in the relevant sections. That's one thing that, again, it's highly verbose. It makes it easy to skim the rules and kind of get the flavor of things for such a large rule book, and then makes it an excellent, excellent resource for looking stuff up. Creating such rules was probably a maintenance nightmare, but amazingly, I don't think there's any errata for this game. I'm not sure, because I've got a couple things penciled in here, but I can't find evidence of why. Maybe I'll find them somewhere else, because I'm a little curious about that. Okay. There are entrenchments and fortifications, which are markers you place on the map. They're kind of permanent installations for the scenario. Well, they get destroyed when the enemy takes them. They offer some combat benefits, and they may also offer supply benefits at certain times. Special forces. These are able to cross unbridged river hexes without having to spend additional movement points. And we'll see something like river hexes. Engineers are able to negate that. You know, so like there's special capabilities baked into these things. And it's going to be really hard to remember some of this stuff. But you'll look and be like, well, what's an engineer do? Well, I thought there was an index on this one. There we go. Yeah, so you can look up under engineers in the index, and you'll find C56L, which is not this page. But my guess is that capability is duplicated over here. There we go. That is a combat advantage of engineers. Okay, well, the indexing is not as good as I'd hoped. Right then. Okay, so anyway, special forces can cross the rivers. They can, some of them can be paradropped. They can all do helicopter assaults. All of them are insurgency capable, and they can trace supply like insurgents. They give a column shift for being special forces. In addition, since they're insurgency, they also give a die roll modifier in combat. Parachute units, they're all capable of being moved by transport strike air missions. And here is the exciting thing, is that you're able to paradrop some armor in this game, which I find really cool. You also have these SAM and AA sites. If you fly over them, they can shoot you. And they can be hit by bombardment strike missions. Let me make sure that I understand that, because you really need a lot of them to cover. I mean, you need to cover every hex. So just want to make sure that they have to be stacked. Yeah, you've got to fly through the hex itself, so there's no... Okay. How about insurgency units? When you want to place insurgency units, what you do is you spend an insurgency command point. Well, hold on. Let me look at the procedure. You have to have insurgency units available. You have to have insurgency command points available. You can look at a friendly ground unit or stack. Each such hex can place one insurgency of its type. Sometimes they're allowed to place associated stuff. I assume the same limitation applies. They can't like place two different nationalities because they have that. You can make as many attempts as you have hexes containing those friendly units, and hexes where insurgency units can be placed. And you use the command points to create the insurgency. The insurgency unit will be in supply throughout the turn in which they appear on the map. But after that turn, they have to trace supply. They have slightly different rules on placing supply, on tracing supply. You expend a command point to do it, and then you roll on the insurgency command table, which we took a peek at here, and that'll give you a yes or a blank. If it gives you a yes, you place it. If it gives you a +1, it indicates you have to spend an extra insurgency point. And there's some modifications here. So for example, the US has an easier time placing its insurgencies. And those are the really well-trained special forces that the US has, as an example. And then we have specifics of where they're limited to be placed, which has to do with a regular ground unit can place them 2 hexes away. They can be placed adjacent to enemy units, but not in the same hex. They can't be placed in cities outside their home countries. If they're placed in a town or port outside their home countries, there's a modifier. And they can be placed in a hex containing friendly units, but not in excess of stacking. Their home countries are listed here. Right. You can also attempt to disband them during... There's 2 different times when you can do that, and there are phases that are specific to that. I find myself having trouble working my way through the phase list. Might help some people. It certainly helps as a mnemonic device while you're trying to figure out, what you're doing for a turn. Disbanding the insurgency units, you point to an insurgency unit and say you're going to disband it. And you roll on the insurgency command table. If you get a yes, you disband it and you get your point back. If you get a minus, it fails and you remain on the map. I don't think there's an extra cost there for the +1s. If the insurgency has to be in supply, it must be within 3 hexes of a regular unit, but it doesn't have to be the proper nationality. Your insurgency can find its way home with an ally. You can only make 1 disband attempt per turn, per phase. And yeah. Aerial counterinsurgency. Right after you've attempted to place insurgents, this should kind of be in between, but the enemy can try to get firepower into play. If they get 3 or more insurgency bombardment points in, remember, the planes all have an insurgency modifier to their bombardment factor, and like an A means doubled, a B means unmodified, a C means half their bombardment factor can be used in counterinsurgency, and a D means they have 0 counterinsurgency value. If you can get 3 points there during the counterinsurgency phase in a single mission, you have suppressed that insurgent, and it doesn't come in, and the points are spent on it, which again, you need air power. You need air cover to create your insurgents, basically. How do these suckers move? Well, for one thing, you can move them as though they're regular units, but they have some special abilities still. They pay no extra movement to cross an unbridged river. If they're moving alone, and this applies to both types of movement, if they end their movement in a city, town, or port controlled by the opposing player, originally controlled, that should say, you have to perform a special combat. You're basically fighting the police there, and I don't remember if there's a special. No, you fight on an odds table, I think. Okay, you can use boat and river transport during regular movement, and they talk about what that means in terms of types of boats. So if you're doing insurgency movement, you're using canoes and stuff. If you're doing it as a regular unit, you're using motorized boats that are more detectable. Okay, the other option though is you can do Insurgency Movement, and you're allowed to move up to 4 hexes. If you move 2 hexes or less, you can take an Insurgency Reserve marker, which will allow you to move 2 more hexes, or up to 2 more hexes, on another turn. Now, what's big about this is that you don't pay additional movement points. It's cost by hex. You're able to freely move through enemy zones of control. You can move through water hexes. However, you might be intercepted from Tiger Island. If you end your insurgency movement in a city, town, or port, you still have to fight it, unless it's already been captured. And the Insurgency Reserve marker means you cannot pursue as a support unit after combat. We talked about Gulf of Fonseca table. We got a whole nother section on it there. Doesn't really... and the reserve movement, you can't end in a city, town, or port controlled by the opposing player because you won't get a combat phase. You can't end movement in a water hex, you would drown. Let me pause it here. Somebody. Emergency units have some special combat capabilities. They give a die roll modifier, as I mentioned before. They have to fight if they're in a population center, and that ends up being an attack against an intrinsic die roll, an intrinsic strength defense of 1, the local police. If the population center has to take either a step loss or a retreat, the insurgency unit wins the battle. Otherwise, it's going to be, if it's forced to retreat or step loss, it is forced out of the hex. Now, is it possible both could take... it is possible that, like, the insurgency could take a retreat result and the population center takes a step loss. That's not really clarified here, so... I think what we say is if the insurgency had to retreat, the police would be reestablished because control was never established there, even if they took a step loss, because they don't disappear for the game. They come back as soon as it's uncontrolled. Regular ground combat, they give their bonus, and that's about it. If they take losses, okay. Most insurgency units that are lost come back 2 turns later on the turn record track, and then you can buy them again with insurgency points. The exception to this is special forces, which are gone forever if you manage to get them destroyed. So you want to get them out of locations. Pursuit, which is basically the advance after combat rolls in this game, and not like Pursuit in Vietnam. You're allowed to have 1 insurgency unit that was involved in the combat advance after combat as the support unit. You're basically allowed 1 regular unit, 1 support unit in order to advance. We're going to have to stop for the supply rules because I'm starving. Nice to head into a long weekend. A little vacation maybe from our own ongoing unrest and revolution. Yeah, I laugh, but, you know, who the hell knows what's going to happen. All right. So, supplies. We have specific supply sources, which include the entrenchment counters that go on the map, and specific cities. Now, I don't know if they describe... here. I was hoping to see something better than this. It's the entrenchment, Guatemalan, Honduran, Salvadoran, and Costa Rican supply sources. Well, that's not very helpful. Is it on the board? It may be, yeah, I thought so. So these little symbols indicate supply sources. Now, what's interesting about them is although they're printed on the map, they're destroyed when they're occupied by enemy ground units, and then they are no longer a supply source. So you could basically wipe out a faction's capability to fight by taking away its supply sources permanently, at least in the scope of the scenario. Now, we also, of course, have depots, which are kind of very limited supply sources. FDN and ARDA can use captured air facilities for supply. That's using the Southern Airways supply. If you recall, if you're old enough and you recall, a U.S. company had one of its planes shot down, and it was determined that we were kind of secretly supplying through that channel. Kind of an interesting situation. FSLN and FMLN, Entrenchments and Fortifications, Nicaraguan supply sources, and the communist markers. The Nicaraguans also have logistic supply units, which I think, have mobility to them. So they have their own special mobile supply units, essentially. There's limitations to which countries can use whose supply sources. In particular, kind of interesting things here. So what really bugs me is the CMA can't use Costa Rican or ARDA supply, but ARDA can use the Southern Airways supply. Now, Southern Airways was part of CMA, the Civilian Military Authority, which I'm not sure, again, what this linkage is, why this choice was made. Again, the designer really is into the subject matter. So I'm going to just de facto trust, what's going on there. But, and by into I mean, this is what he was doing for a living in depth. So, not writing games, but dealing with these matters. Obviously not revealing classified information directly, but there might be hints of stuff that gets through any vetting process. So the FSLN has these supply units that work as, I believe, armor type movement. Armored movement costs. There's also the supply depots, which basically you get once you place them on the map and use them, and they basically last for one turn. They go away and you don't have them anymore. You're allowed to place them in city sports air facilities that you control. Unlike the LSU, you have to actually move them. Now, I don't remember if the LSU is a temporary supply unit as well. I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Can you capture supply units? Again, I don't think so. Okay. But they can be transported. They have a weight, etc. Your actual supply line is a number of hexes. I don't remember how many. 4 hexes. Without roads or trails, they have to be ones the units can move through, and then a combination of roads and trails. Again, ones they can move through. I believe trails can become non-active during certain weather. Back to a supply source. If an air facility can trace back to an active supply source or a supply depot, it can activate all its air units and helicopters. The way the supply depot works is you flip it over and it's usable for that turn as a supply source. However, there are some cases where the supply depot doesn't have to flip over and in fact can't be flipped over to work as a supply source, particularly reorganizing units. Regular units can't trace their supply through a zone of control. Obviously not through an enemy unit. Insurgents have slightly different supply rules, which we'll hit. First turn of the game, you're in supply. And yes, I know I've kind of ignored a couple of questions that have come up. I've expressed them and then I don't have an answer. I'm sure I could find it, but I don't feel like it's worthwhile for this level of look at the rules. The insurgency rules have slightly less restrictive supply rules. The Southern Airways supply, the way this works is you take a supply source, you take an air facility inside Honduras, and then you deliver what amounts to another supply source that's linked to that, and an airplane, a C-123. You might be able to use something else. I know you're able to use Honduran planes for it. And that's going to be permanently responsible for delivering supplies from the one supply source in Honduras to another airfield supply source, presumably in Nicaragua, where it's harder for your forces to have supplies. And if the in Honduras supply source is captured, I believe you're able to you're able to bring it back into play six turns later. If the Honduran supply head is captured, and I'm just making up the term, but you know what I mean, then both counters are removed from the game, and you will not be able to reestablish that Southern Airways supply again. Okay. If you can't trace a supply line, you get a little out of supply marker, and in particular there are limitations on that. For ground units, you have your defense strength and movement allowance halved, and you're not allowed to attack. But you can always move one hex as long as it's not prohibited terrain. You still have a zone of control as normal. You can't do air defense attacks, and Insurgency are able to do their insurgency movement without any limitations. They don't get halved. Air units can't perform air missions if they're out of supply. The air units are all considered sitting, and if there's a bombardment strike, they'll be destroyed on an A result on the terrain feature. An unsupplied helicopters has its movement radius halved, and its ground combat and bombardment are dropped to 0. Its air combat is reduced to 1 or 0, whichever is greater. It's reduced to 1. You know what I mean. I mean, they word it here properly. It cannot perform offensive or defensive air combat missions. It cannot perform a transport strike. It can do a transfer, though. Up to double its reduced movement. Supply depot markers. During a supply phase, you can flip over a depot marker and make units that can trace to that are in supply, and that's all units on the board. There's no limitation. A depot contains an infinite amount of supply for one turn. No weird abstraction there, but whatever. Okay, bombardment. I've already kind of explained this. It is an air mission, and you've got some charts that you have to look at to see if you're bombing a terrain feature, and there's a bunch of different modifiers to it, and you get your result. Air-to-air combat. This is something we have not dealt with, and bombarding ground units is similarly that. Okay, so this is actually pretty deep. The first thing is, to have air-to-air combat, you have to have an interception. To have an interception, you have to have an enemy air mission happening within EW detection. If it's helicopters, there has to be a ground unit that is in the hex that sees the helicopters go by and calls up the EW unit. Okay, it's not exactly that, but they're able to track the unit that way. If it's regular air units, they can be detected anywhere in range of the EW. And once that's done, the intercepting player, who's the non-phasing player, I think in most cases, the exception to that being the insurgency removal, where the phasing player would be doing the interception, can gather up planes within range of that EW. And again, most of the EWs are range 3, but Messiah and the AWACS, EWACS have range 10. You gather up air units that are within range. You might be able to make a combined air from different bases, and you send the planes in. Now, the planes, in order to intercept, have to have a speed that can catch the slowest of the planes that are conducting the mission. Okay, so we've got that DSJ, defensive is the slowest type of plane they're assumed to be. There might be some 0Js out there, just as a case though. Okay, and then you determine who the defender is. Well, the Ds are always the defender. Helicopters will be using an air combat value of only one helicopter in the stack. A stack of entirely D units uses the lowest air combat value in the stack. A stack containing Ds and S and or Js use the S and or J units combining their air combat value. The Ds don't take place in the combat. The 0Js, if they get intercepted and they're alone, then there's no air combat resolve. The 0Js are destroyed. Obviously, they can only be intercepted by things that have firepower. So how does the air combat itself work? Okay. At the point of interception, the player who's just been intercepted declares which of his planes he's going to strip off and use as escorts. Now, again, there's this huge abstraction going on here. In Gulf Strike, you put markers under the counters and say, and you've got all kind of little games that you're playing here where you could send up what looks like an air mission. The enemy might be able to identify what the planes are, but they don't know what they're being used for. And they don't know whether you're doing you're using your A-10s as just ground strike planes, or if maybe some of them are actually carrying air-to-air equipment. Obviously, you might be able to discern, make some judgments based on the planes there. That's got nothing to do with this game. With this game, the stack is moving there. The defender gets to choose what they want to do with their planes. And, at the moment of interception, what were they armed with? You have to determine tactical air initiative. This is based on quality of electronics warfare that's present. And basically the AWACS and the US EW units trump everything else. But Messiah is the next highest level thing. And then communist EW capabilities, which might be flying with the planes. If there's no EW present, the person who's initiating the attack has the initiative. And then they kind of repeat that in different ways, which is interesting, and I'm not quite sure the reasoning for that. Anyway, whoever has the tactical air initiative gets to choose to be the attacker and defender unless it's intercepted helicopters, and there may be some other things that kind of fit in here. Always D's is a defender. You probably want to be the defender. The odds go in your favor that way. The players add up, hold on, there might be other effects. The players add up the total number of friendly and enemy air units and our helicopters involved, including intercepting air units, escort units, EW air units, transports, and other combat missions. So you're counting the number of planes, and that's going to be your intensity level. And the divisions are at 6 to 7, and 12 to 13, between low, medium, and high. Then you add up the combat value of intercepting and escort units, not the units that are committed to other missions. The combined, they're not really committed at this point because they could be intercepted again and change their mission. The combined air combat values are compared to get a ratio on the air combat table. And again, you have different ones for each intensity. You get your ratio, and we'll see the reasoning for things. You count up modifiers, which include the EW factors, and I think that's about it. air facility. If the air facility is right under the hex, that counts. It's sort of an EW type thing. The attacking player rolls the die and applies the modifiers to get a modified die roll, and he cross-references the combat ratio to get a result. The players then apply the results. The intercepting air units never take step losses if they're attacking D air units or helicopters. Now, yeah. Okay. Intercepting air units will go back to their air facility. So I'm not sure why, if you can get the initiative, why you don't declare yourself the defender. But we'll keep going. Maybe there's something that applies differently. The players apply the combat results to their units. The intercepting air units are returned to an air facility within their movement radius and are placed in used space. They've done their mission for the turn. The intercepted air units and helicopters that took no adverse results at all can continue their mission. If the air combat has an R in it, though, and again, the rules are kind of, they're understandable, but they're kind of like, they didn't nail that down quite as well as possible. Which is fine. They certainly used enough words. The R says you have to return, but you don't. You can choose to double the number of losses you take. And if you get a 0R somehow, I don't know if there are some of those, there should be, you have to take one loss or retreat. And I don't see a 0R there, so I'm kind of confused. But okay. Stack of friendly air units can be attacked every time they move into a different hex that's in detection range. Helicopters can be intercepted every time they enter a hex with enemy units in detection range. The results, number of steps lost. Yeah, see, I just don't see that 0R. Okay. The step losses are handled by flipping a unit over if it has a flip side. Otherwise, eliminating a unit that's already flipped or that doesn't have a flip side. I'm looking here on a result of 0R. That implies that there should be such a result. And I don't know if I'm just like zoning out and not seeing it, or I would expect it to be down here. And I just don't see it. And that's what I don't get. Was it removed, or is there something that modifies and changes the damage levels? The owning player takes one step loss to conduct the mission. There might be something that reduces your losses, but I'm not aware of it, and that's the problem here. Okay, ground to air combat. When you fly over enemy units, there is a chance that they have the capability to do air defense. And there's, again, a little table, some modifiers you follow on. The units are different types. There's SAMs and AA units, which obviously have that capability. But there's also stacks of 2 or more U.S. ground units, or stacks containing 2 or more specific Nicaraguan units that have a little AA marker on them. They have to pair up to use that, and stacks of 2 or more Cuban ground units. I wish they had put the AA marker on all the units that had the capability. They only put it on the Nicaraguan ones because most of the Nicaraguan units don't have it, but it would be helpful. That's what I remember. Let me see. Yeah, so like the U.S. units do not have this symbol. The Nicaraguans, let's find one. Here's one that has it. You can see the little anti-air symbol there, the same as the anti-air unit there. I find that kind of a shame because it's easier to remember, and it would have been possible to put that on the Cuban and U.S. units as a good reminder. It would not cost anything extra to add that little bit of information to the counter, and there's space for it on all of them. Ground combat. Okay. Right. The ground combat table, I think, is only on the board. I don't think that there, because it needs the multiple colors. I don't think it's reproduced in here. Good. Okay. For ground combat, you're not forced to have ground combat in general. Remember, insurgent units inside a population center have to be forced. But if you choose to attack adjacent units, you have to attack all defending units that are adjacent. You can use multiple units from different hexes to attack a single enemy-occupied hex. You can elect to have some of your units attack at low odds, so you can concentrate and attack units at higher odds with another group. Out-of-supply units are not allowed to attack. The attacking player declares what will attack what and resolves them one at a time. And let's go over the basics, and then we'll hit specific things. So you cross-reference the terrain type with an odds ratio, and you got bunches of modifiers, which we'll hit some of, and then you roll, and it looks to me like the game probably has a 10-sided die. Excuse me. Let's look at our components. No, it's a 6-sided die. Interesting. A lot of the victory game stuff used a 10-sided die. I was expecting that here with that chart. The modifiers, of course, change matters, and it ranges from -1 up to 9. So it could have gone either way. I thought it would be a 10-sider. Okay, air missions and ground combat. If you do a close air support mission, you get a +1 to the die roll for each bombardment point that you dropped in the close air support. You can only use one plane, one air counter to do that, though. So some of them have very, very powerful bombardment capabilities. Offensive ground support, this is helicopters. You can use up to 2 of them to attack, and I believe 1 to defend, and it just, that's the defensive ground combat support. It adds the combat value to the unit, but it also gives a column shift in your favor for that support. Lots of examples in here. So, transport strike units, and ground combat. You can drop units or transport them in helicopters or whatever into a hex either adjacent or containing enemy ground units, I believe. So parachute units have more trouble in surviving if you're dropping them into a zone of control or on a unit. Let me make sure that you can do this on a unit. Into or adjacent to hexes, yeah. For paradrop and helicopter assault, you have to make a roll in both cases to see what survives the landing. And that's this table, modifiers again. If you're transported into clear or rough terrain containing enemy units, that's the only way you can do it. You must attack those units during the ground combat phase. Again, it's an exception to the general rule of you may attack. Unlike other ground attacks, the Paradrop, they must attack only the units in the hex they jointly occupy. The owning player can have these units attack other enemy units in adjacent hexes, but then they get added in, all adjacent units. Okay, so again, this statement is not correctly phrased, but whatever. Ground units transported to unoccupied hexes adjacent to enemy units in the air mission phase have an option to attack, as usual. If they do, they must attack all adjacent units. They could also join friendly units in an attack that are already there. Okay, insurgency units. Insurgency units that are involved in a combat add their strength to the combat, and they also get a bonus to the die roll. They have to attack population centers. They still get their bonus to the die roll. Population centers themselves. If you're defending in a city, and only a city, not a capital, or capital cities? I think capitals have that capability too, but I'm not positive. Capital, okay. then the value of one of the units defending is doubled. Only one unit is doubled. In addition, you get a -1 die roll modifier as long as one of the units is in the city. These do not apply to attack helicopters that are defending. And they don't affect ground units attacking out of the city. You're not doubled from coming out. Now, we come to the first place where I've crossed some stuff out, and I don't know the providence of this. So I am going to play as though the rules are written as they're written, unless I find some reason not to. Which I may in other rule books eventually. Units defending in cities can ignore retreat results from combat. If units attack out of a city and are forced to retreat, the owning player can take a step loss in addition to any called for the combat result to remain in the city. Now that's what I crossed out. Again, that may be in contradiction to something, and that's why I crossed it out. Ground units defending in a town or port get a die roll modifier, but they don't get any of the other benefits. We've talked about supply effects on combat. Mountain jungle hexes in combat. Armor are allowed to attack into mountain jungle hexes only along roads and trails. And that means they don't have to attack, because they cannot, units that are not along the road, which means they might attack a unit and have another unit near them, which they're not forced to actually attack. It's kind of a weird situation. You're able to reach islands during the air mission phase by transporting them, during regular ground unit movement phase, via boat transport, and during insurgency movement, just walking on water because you've got Jesus with you. Units moving into the Gulf of Fonseca have certain specific difficulties getting to the island. Defending units will benefit from an entrenchment marker. Attacks against units on island cannot be made across all water hex sides. Thus, communist ground unit in Potosi can't attack. You actually have to land on the island to attack. Okay. You add up the attack values of your ground units that are making the attack, the Insurgency's Paradrop and helicopter assault units, and attack helicopters all get added in. The defending player adds up his defense values with the appropriate modifiers, and etc. The attack value is compared to defense value. That gives you your ratio. You look at the terrain, you roll a die, and you play any column shifts into play. There are quite a few possibilities there. Again, listed here is the column shifts, the die rolls. Now here I have again another penciled out, a CIA EW ground unit that's within 3 hexes of at least one, and it says attacking ground unit, allied ground unit, or one defending communist ground unit. Again, I think I may have penciled something in by mistake, or with my own thinking in mind. I don't remember my mind state when I first was playing this, but and you know, it was so long ago. I may have made modifications to the game because I thought it should be that way. I'm not going to do that without some evidence because I don't trust me. I don't trust where these two came from, and they're the only couple in it. As if I thought I saw inconsistencies there and was like copy editing it. Artillery give column shifts unless they are half strength with an attack value of 0. The table itself. Let's see what we got here. Let's talk about the results you get. Numbers is number of steps losses you get, and they work as normal. Remember, armor can have more than 2 steps. And, you know, lots of details here to go over it instead of a general rule, whatever. We know the general rule in the back of our head, right? Okay, what about who has to retreat? That's here. Okay, the ratio boxes are colored either red, white, or blue. When the current combat ratio marker is in a red box, the attacking units must retreat after combat. When it's in a blue box, the defenders must retreat. If it's in a white space, then the red or blue areas corresponding to the modified die roll determine which side retreats. The color in the ratio box has precedence over the color of the die roll, which you'll see where the color of the ratio box is set and is fixed, all the boxes that apply to that work. Now, the column shift modifiers, there's going to be counters that handle that, and that's the current attack ratio thing. So you're not looking at like the initial rating or anything there. You're looking at what the modified column is that you're going to work on. But if you're in any of the columns that have a white space on them, they have to have the different possibilities. Now, what happens if you get white and white? I think nobody has to retreat. Okay. When you're attacking an island, if you do not clear the island, well, the defending units on the island are not allowed to retreat. They must take an extra step loss in addition to any called for the combat result to remain on the island. Is that always an option? I don't think so. I think that's an option in cities and in... But I may be missing something here. Okay. Well, we'll see if retreats handle that. If the defending ground units remain on the island, the attacker failed and they're destroyed. But a stack of attacking regular ground and or insurgency units take an extra step loss. Well, what the hell? If defending ground unit remains, attacking paradrop and helicopter assault units are destroyed, yeah. A stack of attacking regular ground units and or insurgency units takes an extra step loss and has to leave. Okay, so that's how it works. The stack of units go back to the nearest coast of its side. Retreats in pursuit. Okay, so usually somebody has to retreat. That person, no. So that person either has to retreat or take an extra step loss. And again, that's why I penciled this out, was if units attack out of a city and are forced to retreat, the owning player can take a step loss in addition to any. That's standard rules. Why are you repeating that? Well, again, I don't think there's any special benefit. I don't think that attacking out of a city allows you to just remain in that city. I think I probably thought that why state this, it's the standard rule. Now I'm older and understand that sometimes people state things they don't have to state. But again, I may have found some errata somewhere. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Wait a minute. Units that are unable to retreat must take an extra step loss if called upon to retreat. This step loss is in addition to other losses called for by the combat. Okay, let's keep going. Ground units occupying a city, an entrenchment, or a fortification can ignore all retreat results, and they do not have to take a step loss to remain in the hex. Again, I'm going to go with the cross out there. And that's leading me to say, maybe I want to go with the other one because I think there's probably reason for this. Okay. Ground units, yeah. Okay, if the owning player does retreat his units, he must move them 2 hexes back away. They have to try to move towards the supply source of the nationality or side. There are some restrictions. In general, they can't go through an unoccupied hex in an enemy zone of control, but they can go through an occupied hex in an enemy zone of control. They're not supposed to go across water, but again, sometimes they can if they're on an island. They can't be retreated, well, the attacking units. They cannot be retreated into in excess of stacking limitations. They can retreat off a map edge, but then they're gone. Units in a stack must be retreated as a stack. They can't be split up. Important for the stacking limits. Insurgents are a little bit looser, though. They can retreat through unoccupied zones of control, but they can't end their retreat in one. And they can retreat through water and across all water hex sides, as long as they end up on land. If insurgency units retreat off the map's edge, they're eliminated and placed on the game turn 2 turns ahead without returning points, I guess. The insurgency units must retreat as a stack. They lose their insurgency reserve if they do it. Oh, we gotta be getting close. Paradrop and a helicopter assault. Okay, if the enemy is forced out, the paradrop and helicopter assault units remain in the hex. This is when you attack a hex with an airdrop of some sort. If the hex still has enemy ground units after the combat, or if the attacking units have to retreat by the combat table, they must retreat. If they can't, they're eliminated. If no friendly ground units are adjacent to the combat hex, they're all okay. So remember the zone of control restriction on retreating? If you've got an airdrop type situation, you are allowed to retreat through one hex of enemy zone of control that's not protected by your own units. However, if there are friendly units next to you, you must retreat through them. You're not allowed to use this exemption. I've got to swap batteries, but we'll finish this section before I pause. A little bit more of a break than I intended, but helicopters. If helicopters perform paradrops or helicopter assaults, they're rotated 90 degrees if they stick around. But if the enemy units in the hex were eliminated or forced to retreat, they can choose to stay, and that's fine. And during their return to base, they turn 180 degrees. And they remain in supply. Well, the ground troops remain in supply throughout the turn of the transport strike mission and throughout the next turn. If the paratrop and or helicopter assault were forced to retreat from the hex, however, they're moved to a friendly supplied hex within their movement radius during return to base, and they're rotated 180 degrees. They do not take any special step losses for this. But attack helicopters that did not participate in ground combat go back to a base, and if their hexes are occupied by enemy ground units, they take no additional step losses. Those that did offensive ground combat support missions, which is where they add their strength, not a bombardment, in a hex can remain in the hex if the hex is vacated by the enemy ground units. One can remain in each hex, or in the hex for each supplied ground unit in the hex. If the hex still contains enemy ground units during return to base, the attack helicopters have to go back home, and they do not take a step loss, although the counter is rotated. Wow. They keep saying that nothing takes a step loss. I'm expecting something to take one. All right, let's keep going. Attack helicopters on defensive ground support can remain if they control their hex. If the hex has been vacated by them, they're immediately returned to a friendly supplied hex within their movement radius, rotated 180 degrees. If somebody pursues into their hex after combat, one of the defending helicopters has to take a step loss. Okay, there you go. Finally. All right, pursuit. This is the advance after combat rolls. You're allowed to move one attacking infantry or armor and one support unit into the hex. This has to happen immediately after the combat, before you move on to another one. So the regular units are listed here. These are all mainly normal units except for the tank. That's the only special thing. And then here are the support units. They can be from different hexes. Paratroop drop and helicopter assault units cannot use pursuit in the turn they were transported if they were moved into a hex containing enemy ground units. But if they were moved adjacent, they're allowed to pursue into the hex they just attacked. Kind of makes sense. Insurgency units can't normally pursue, but they can be used as the support unit if they don't have an insurgency reserve. Armor can pursue into jungle and mountain, but only if there's a road or trail. Salvadorian infantry, Honduran infantry, infantry brigades, Honduran infantry regiments, Nicaraguan, specific types of brigades can only pursue if they have rotor trail. And these are basically your motorized units. All right, lots of example of combat here. Obviously, we're not going to go through that. I would love to finish this up right now. Why don't we? There's almost nothing left. I thought I was going to break here, but you know, I took a couple minutes to clear my throat a little and whatnot. Okay, reorganization is pretty simple. You have reorg points available probably on your track from the scenario, and you're basically unflipping flipped combat units. Key point, armor can't go from a reduced counter back up to its full strength counter. So let's say it's a 3 or 4 step armor unit. The first couple steps, the first step loss, it can recover and be full strength. If it takes 2 step losses, it switches counters and it can never make it back up to full strength. Okay. In order to reorganize, you can't be in an enemy zone of control. You have to be able to trace supply to a source or a depot. The depot is not expended for this, and it can't be traced to an exhausted depot, i.e. one that you've already used that turn to supply units, which is kind of weird, but okay. Okay. And I've talked about tanks. Insurgency units. Insurgency units can be reorganized by expending an insurgency command point or a reorg point of the appropriate type. And they can be reorganized in enemy zones of control as long as they can trace the supply line. You can't move. You get a reorg marker on your counter, and it spends the turn doing nothing. If it's attacked, you lose the reorg marker, and you end up losing the point you spent on it. Now, the interesting thing about insurgents units is you have to spend an insurgency point to reorg it, and it takes a turn of doing nothing. You might be better disbanding the unit, getting your insurgency point back, and then using that point to redeploy the unit. However, that will not always be the case. Rebuilding units. Regular infantry units only can be rebuilt with reorg points as well. You can spend 3 reorganization points of the appropriate type to build a regular infantry unit, and it's placed on the grain box track 3 boxes ahead. And then in your reinforcement phase, you get to place it on any available supply source, not a depot, of the unit's nationality or size. If there isn't one, well, you screwed yourself and you lose the unit and the points that you already spent. Specifics towards where they can be rebuilt. You do not rebuild insurgency units in this way. You rebuild them by doing the insurgency placement. All right, that is the end of the rules for the conventional game. We are not going to touch the intervention game yet. It's a smaller rule book, and I should be able to do it quickly, but this thing has gone way too long. It probably should have been split in half anyway, but I can't tell how long my videos are anymore. Same brand camera doesn't work as well. Much more expensive, newer version, whatever. I don't know if it's more expensive. It's probably the same price. We'll touch these when we're ready to go into an intervention scenario. I want to test out the roles a little bit with, some of the scenarios. This is going to be a fairly light one. Not a lot of insurgency going on. Not a lot of air units, etc. It's the soccer war. But it's the earliest of the scenarios. Not the first one that you're supposed to do, but I don't want to do the first one. I want to do this one. It's the first one chronologically. I always seem to do that. Although I got my CWB games, the Civil War Brigade series, I failed completely, and probably with some other things too. All right, let's send this up, and I don't think I'm going to start today. I know it's still daylight and everything, but I'm just like fatigued from work and everything.